So we saw that if we can create modularity, then we get various benefits, including we don't need mappings anymore because everyone uses the same ontology when they're talking about proteins, for instance. Annotations can be additive because we know that they are consistent to the extent that they are not inconsistent because of errors made by the people responsible, but those errors will be more likely detected because each ontology will get more users, and each ontology will bring commitment from the users to making sure that errors are eliminated because they rely on it. So one of the drawbacks of stovepipes is that each of them has relatively few users, and so errors are less likely to be detected. People get trained, which means that when they work in one module, they get trained and they can reuse their expertise to work on other modules. And this turns out to be very valuable, given that we have a shortage of people who know how to build ontologies. And similarly, we can benefit from the lessons learned by one group to make improvements in other modules, because to some degree, the improvements are portable too. And so the idea is we create plug-and-play ontology modules which have a high likelihood of being reused because everyone will know about them. And sometimes it's easy. Protein ontology is easy. Sometimes it's more difficult, as in the case of the Darwin core, where the domain is much more diffuse. Each ontology is created incrementally, and the suite is created, it grows incrementally. So we have the benefits of incrementality. We can reuse existing ontology resources. So as you will see, we get a lot of benefits from the idea of downward population. We have simple general ontologies near the top, and then as we go further down, we get more and more specific ontologies. We have, and then we can use all of the ontologies to annotate the same data. So the gene ontology, the protein ontology, the RNA ontology can be used simultaneously to annotate the same data. Rather than having one big data annotation vocabulary, we have several small ones which are built to interoperate. And division of labor is crucially important here. Now, on the other hand, we have the logical issues, the software issues. And as I say, I'm not going to talk much about these. So OWL is a resource which certainly brings benefits, but those benefits are primarily on the side of syntax and on the side of software support. We have good OWL editors. People know about OWL, they rely on OWL. But that doesn't mean they write good ontologies. Just as people who know English don't necessarily thereby write good novels. Writing ontologies needs more than just OWL. And really that is the main reason for the explosion of ontological nonsense, is because people can use OWL very easily, but they can't do ontology yet. So what we need are standards on the side of semantics or meaning, or as I like to conceive it, we have standards for understanding reality in the ontological way. Because what an ontology is a representation of the types of entities in reality. And these standards can be taught and disseminated, socialized through the community of people building ontologies if we have a common top level, if we use common relations, and if the lower level domain-specific ontologies, the ontologies nearer the bottom, are created from the upper level ontologies by a standardized method. So the ontology which is used as the upper level ontology within the Oboe Foundry is Buffo, as we already explained. You can find the website here, and there are something like 120 ontology projects using Buffo, most of them in the biological or biomedical domains, but now also in other domains. There will one day be a physics ontology based on Buffo, which we've just started work on. And again, having a common upper-level ontology helps to constrain the ontologies built in its terms. It's not a panacea. Yep, it's ifomis.org/BFO. So it gives you something to teach. And so you can tell people you have to learn this before you start building ontologies, and that will stop certain kinds of mistakes. And it will give people a certain expertise. So there are now people who know how to build ontologies using Buffo. And as soon as you have a number of people with that expertise, then those people will understand new ontology work better. Because they will see where the gaps are, where the problems are, because they will have seen something similar before. So each ontology will not be a new continent. It will be something that you can manage and grapple with. The upper-level ontology provides a starting point for downward population to create your domain ontology. And the fact that you're using a common upper level will promote shareability. So other people can use the ontology because it's compatible with the ontologies that they already use. So this is the picture. Basic formal ontology is at the very top. We have, I'm just mentioning these as at random, the information artifact ontology, which is an ontology for entities like data, database ontology, text, document, publication, those kinds of things, software. We have the ontology for biomedical investigations, which I think is going to be relevant for nearly everyone in this room, because this is an ontology of things like samples, protocols, equipment, DNA repositories, staining, statistics, everything which is involved in doing an investigation, including taking, storing, measuring samples. And then we have the ontology of general medical science, which is a top-level, very small ontology of things like patient, disease, therapy, treatment, symptom, and so forth. And you'll see that we have the infectious disease ontology here. The infectious disease ontology is created by downward population from OGMs, which is created by downward population from Buffo. What does that mean? Well, let me find the relevant slide here. So you take your ontology editor, which will likely be Protege. You import Buffo, which gives you this. And then you start at the term in Buffo, which is your top-level term for your domain. Now, each cell is an object in Buffo terms. So you don't use any of this. You just go straight to object, and then you start populating your cell types. And if you do it that way, then you know that you're not going to make certain simple mistakes. And by populating, I mean defining. So a cell is an object which... Now if we go back. So Buffo is a simple top-level ontology, which is, it was built to support this kind of scientific information integration. And this is the very top level, very simple presentation. So we have two kinds of entities. We have continuants, which continue. For instance, cells, organisms, planets, mountains. And we have occurrents, which are processes or events, like my arms waving now. And there are two kinds of continuants. Independent continuants, which are basically things with molecules inside them. And dependent continuants, which are what otherwise might be called properties or characteristics or attributes or traits or features or aspects. We have a very... We're trying to be restricted in our vocabulary choices. And so we allow just two kinds of dependent continuants, as you will see in a minute, with many subkinds. Now, every event or every process, every occurrence depends upon some participant thing. So nothing ever happens unless it happens in or to something. And similarly, every dependent continuant depends upon some independent continuant. So there is no characteristic without an entity. Everyone okay? Now, the gene ontology corresponds, broadly speaking, this is not unproblematic, but broadly speaking to this tripartite division in that every cellular component is an independent continuant, every molecular function is a characteristic in this generalized sense, and every biological process is an occurrent. So the three ontologies of the gene ontology correspond to the three top levels of Buffo. And then the two subtypes of dependent continuant are quality and disposition. So a quality is something like a temperature or a color. A disposition is something like a potential or power or function. So the function of this the function of this cup to hold coffee is a disposition in the Buffo sense.
Just to highlight one of the syntactic confusions that arises sometimes with working with the Darwin core community is occurrence or a current, because an occurrence in Darwin core speak is a continuance.
Yes, so that's one of the things that we need to sort out. So words, that you are free to choose your own words, providing you define them. So not everyone should use Buffo. Obviously, the world would be a better place if everyone used Buffo. But not everyone must use Buffo, but if they don't use Buffo, then they need to define their terms so that the meaning is clear. And this is just to make life easy. You're provided with a template, which a lot of people are using, and it turns out to be very easy to use to create definitions. Now, the next step, which we've talked a little bit about earlier, and which is the afternoon topic. Yes?
So, I'm a little bit familiar with Buffo, and
yeah.
I think it borrows from Dolce.
Yeah?
Yeah. The whole top distinction of continuant and occurrent, I can sort of force my worldview into it. But, I mean, I don't know if it's somehow, in some sense, ontologically more sound than some other approaches. For instance, you could imagine some sort of more of a process philosophy type of top-level ontology. And, you know, if you're into Eastern philosophy, you know, everything is occurring. I mean, everything is basically processed. And the whole notion of a continuant, well, are you talking about universals? Does that map to universals and occurrence?
I'm coming to that. So that's what type means up here. But let me deal with process ontology. So if you just want to have a process ontology, then you just ignore everything to the left. So Buffo is a process ontology. It's just, it gives you also this extra bit. So it's not incompatible with the process ontology, it's just trying to do more. And it's actually quite hard to make these two live together within a single framework, logically speaking. So process ontology makes your life easier. OWL is very, very well suited for process ontology. Many of the problems that you have coding with OWL disappear if everything in the universe is just a process.
Why is that?
Because OWL is, in its bones, a four-dimensional ontology. So we talk about this offline, but I can also show you some literature where this is made clear. So four-dimensionalism and process ontology really come down to the same thing. And OWL is very well suited for those things. And many problems we face using OWL arise because we want to deal with these things. Now, why do we want to deal with these things? Well, I started working on Buffo with people who were involved with me in a project in medical ontology. Now, if you're dealing with medicine and you go to doctors and you say, there are no patients, there are no bones, there are no hearts, there are no cells, there are just processes, they'll kick you out of the room. So we had to have those things in there. And then the next step was these, so that gives you these things. The next step is these things. What are diseases? Now, diseases are certainly not things. Diseases always involve a disease course, but the same disease can have very different courses according to whether you take drugs or don't take drugs, or lazy, not lazy. So the disease is the same, even though the disease course is very different. So we need the diseases somewhere else, and they go here, in fact. Diseases are dispositions, according to the Ogham's framework. Now, you can do Eastern philosophy. You can do process ontology. And I would challenge you on that basis to do ontologies which will be accepted by scientists. And if you get more scientists who accept what you do, I will join you immediately. Also, I would... Yeah?
I think maybe that's the wrong way to look at it.
Yeah?
Because, so if I'm trying to if I'm a scientist and I'm trying to put my terms within this context, I need to have an understanding of when something is an occurrent and when it is a continuant.
Yeah.
So just having these two things
Yeah.
begs the question, I have a term, does it fit in this category or does it fit in this
Yeah,
other
good.
category? And so it's, yeah.
So I think that it will be different from case to case. It will depend to some degree on your definition. So there are certain problem cases which are well known in the literature on Dolce-Buffo type ontology. So, and I'll give you some examples. Is a forest fire a continuant or an occurrent? Is an epidemic a continuant or an occurrent? Is a storm a continuant or occurrent? Is an ocean wave a continuant or an occurrent? So these are the classic examples. Every single one of those is a continuant. Unproblematically. How do I know? Because you can take a photograph of it at different times. You can say, the forest fire is there, the forest fire is there, the forest fire is there. And it's moving. Look, you can see the forest fire, it's moving. It was over there yesterday, now it's over here. That's all a continuant talk. And an epidemic, what is an epidemic? Well, it's a pack of monkeys jumping through the forest, latching on to different trees. Some of the monkeys die at the back, and some new monkeys are born at the front. So the epidemic moves forward. A pack of monkeys is a continuant, moving. So they're all actually unproblematic, all the standard problems. However, let me just say one more thing. If you don't like it, treat it as like the QWERTY keyboard, or treat it as driving on the left. You may prefer to drive on the right, but everyone in this town drives on the left. In this town, this isn't quite true, but let's suppose it's true. In this town, everyone uses Buffo. So just shrug your shoulders, use Buffo. Really, you only believe in this. All of this is just talk. But this is what you do when you're in this town. So if you're in the biontology town, you use Buffo, roughly. I hope. Go down on my knees. Yep.
Well, Sean finished?
Yep. Well, I'm finished.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, what are some occurrences?
A current would be the movement of my arm, the movement of the epidemic through the continent, the course of the disease, which means the daily rise and fall in temperature, the growth of the tumor inside the chest, and so forth. So growth, change, all of the movement, change of shape, change of size, fall in temperature, rise in temperature, all of these are occurrences. So occurrences occur. You take videos of them.
What's a mountain?
A mountain is an independent continuant, but it's not an object.
If you look at it fast enough so that you see continents colliding and mountains going up, it changes over time, it's a movie, and therefore it's a verb.
No, the changes in the mountain you take a video of, but the mountain itself is not the change in the mountain, it's that which changes.
So the wave is not water, it's the wave?
So the wave is, at any given time, a certain collection of water molecules.
Okay.
Which water molecules belong to the wave is slightly different from one time to the next. But that's exactly the same with you. Which molecules belong to you is slightly different from 1 minute to the next, because you're breathing. But still, you are a continuant.
At a recent meeting, I asked this question to people in the audience. I said, my old dog just died, 14 years old. Every cell in the dog had been replaced several times over the 14 years. Was it the same dog the whole time? Everybody wants to say, yes, the same dog. And then I said, okay, in that dog's gut was another collection of cells, the microbiota that were in the gut. Over the 14 years, all of those cells changed several times. Same microbiota, and nobody wanted to say it was the same microbiota. So there's clearly an issue here where is it a continuant or an occurrence or what's going on? I don't know whether that parses into that. But
So
it's a scale problem that what looks to be logically equivalent can be perceived as falling in a different class depending on the relative scale of the observer.
So this is what you're saying now is it's an old story, as I'm sure you know. This goes back to the Greeks. People have been puzzling about this for a long time.
Right.
Now, I used to be a philosopher, and I used to worry about these questions. And one day I said, If philosophers have been arguing about these questions for 2,000 years, and if everyone knows that you can take either side, then you shouldn't lose sleep over this. You should just choose one side. So choose my side. That's it.
The problem is when you have two cases that could go either way, and you're trying to find the rule for deciding which one to put in which category. This is
So
what I'm getting
the
at.
rule is the same in both cases. That doesn't mean it's trivial. That's why people argue about it. But we should just stop arguing.
Okay,
You
well, let's see,
agree
what-
that
what-
you are the same.
Right, well, one of the reasons that this group is together, and one of the things that's driving this RCM for GSE, is trying to bring together researchers who are dealing with microbial ecology and researchers who are dealing with traditional biodiversity, and the scale differences, both in space and in time, in microbes versus the larger organisms, is causing, at least
Yeah.
some of the
So
people I'm talking
yeah.
with, things that sound equivalent biologically to want to fall into different classes because
Good.
of the time scale.
So I think I can help you. So you agree that you yourself are the same as you were 5 minutes ago.
In the same way that I stepped into the same river twice.
So now you're being philosophical again. Just answer the question. Are you the same person that you were 5 minutes ago?
If you find the context the same, then I'll tell you.
So I'm going to ask you to lend me money, and if you say no. So will you be the same person tomorrow? My context is, in a minute, I'm going to ask you to lend me $100 for one day.
Okay, I'm trying to figure out how that
Well,
that
try
context-
your favorite answer, and we'll see what happens. I gave you a context. I want to borrow money from you.
Mhm.
Are you going to be the same person tomorrow?
Yeah, more or less. But I'm not going to be quite
All right.
exactly the same person. I'll be a day
So you
older, a day
you
closer
will
to
be
death.
the
I might in fact
same.
even be dead.
So if you're dead, then I win.
No,
I
others-
still. No, I'm going to lend money from him.
In biological terms, the answer to your question is, in 5 minutes, you will be a continuation of an antigen, of him as an antigenetic lineage.
So I think I can accept that. But let me just to try and help you rather than just argue with you. So we have the problem of scale. There are microbiota inside your body. Are they the same microbiota from one day to the next? Now we're dealing with aggregates here. We're dealing with populations and communities. In some, so at some level, for instance, a single microbiota may no longer be there tomorrow. So the question for that microbiotic entity doesn't arise. But on some readings of population, it's the same population. It's just that some of its members have died and some are born. Populations are continuants. Now, I believe that I know that this has been worked out consistently, and it's been eyed critically by many people, many very clever people who want to destroy this thing. The rule is that every part of an independent continuant is an independent continuant. If there are things which are in the vicinity of your organism, which are not independent continuants, then they are not part of you. They are participants in processes involving you.
So the cells in my body are the same cells even though they're not because I'm the same.
So that doesn't make sense. The cells,
If all of the cells in my body are independent continuants,
yeah,
and I'm
in the
an-
technical sense, which is defined.
and I'm an independent continuant,
Yeah.
and we go 5 years and every one of my cells has been replaced, but
Yeah.
I have not been replaced,
Yeah.
how did that happen?
Well, because you are what he just said. You are.
Could I just,
Yeah.
I mean, in
Yeah,
a sense,
go
it's
ahead.
this idea of instituted, it's like an institute. It's an instituted phenomenon. Like the members of any academic institute will change over time, but the institute itself is maintained. It doesn't solve the problem of granularity, but it's sort of an interpretive framework.
Which I'm happy with, actually.
So it's the same gut flora or different gut flora?
So you have to express the question more precisely. Are you talking about the same population? Are you talking about the same aggregate, where the identity criteria are the same members? Almost certainly not in the second sense, but they are in the first sense. But in neither case is anything either a part of you or inside you topologically, which is not an independent continuum. There are things going on inside you, but they're not parts.
Okay, if I take a pointerion, a flatworm, and I cut it in two, and
Yes.
it generates a head on one end
Yes.
and a tail on the other, are those two the same as the first worm?
So these really are old
Yes, they are.
questions.
Are they the same as each other?
So clearly not. Clearly they are not the same. And even if you cut it and they don't regenerate, they're also not the same because the worm doesn't exist
And
anymore.
if I cut it in half and one half dies and the other half regenerates, is the one that survives the same worm?
So that would not be a question for an ontologist.
We're talking about sameness here, and it started with the continuant and the current. You just defined them to be, well, this is, I mean, a continuant can exist for half a second and still be a continuant,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And then the current is a process. It's not a.
Yeah. So the cutting, the regeneration, these are occurrents. The worm, the half worm, the blood on the floor, these are continuants. It's not rocket science, and it's not even important that you believe in it. You just accept it. In the way that you accept driving on the left or on the right, as the case may be. Yes.
Something that's well known from the data warehouses. They don't talk about continuous and changing, but they say slowly changing, fast changing. And what's slow and fast is just relative because it depends on how you're viewing the things.
So are you defending him now?
No.
Sounds as if you're defending him.
Sounds like a compromise.
No, there are no compromises.
There are no compromises. It's either agreement or disagreement.
No, it's acceptance. Yes.
So, one of the things that you said earlier that struck me was that you said from a computer science perspective, like ontologies are just what you can do with them.
Yep.
So I'm going to take a computer science perspective.
Yep.
So I'm just curious, is it that important that we actually get things in the right spot here? Like, what can be done with an occurrent? I mean, is there some type of reasoning that's different with respect to occurrence and continuance, or there's some additional power we get by making these distinctions?
I can only give you examples. So if you look at the literature on defining disease, it's very common for people to say that the disease is a process. And so when the doctor examines the disease or studies the disease, he's studying a process. That view finds it very difficult to cope with the fact that two people, even two identical twins, can have the same disease, but the process in the two is completely different. Now, this tells me that we need to distinguish the disease from the disease process. Now, I could give you a dozen similar cases where what was difficult on one reading becomes easier, not trivial. So there are still problems for the buffer view when you start thinking about how aggregates of molecules, for instance, which are changing, can be identical to larger organisms which are not changing, except in the sense that their molecules are changing. So it's not a trivial issue, but we should stop worrying about it because people have worried about it for 2,000 years, and we know that you can take either side. You should just choose a side.
So I think what you're saying is it somehow simplifies certain.
It gives you a simple strategy to follow, rather like, well, let's everyone drive on the same side of the road, and then all these traffic accidents will cease to happen. It's the same kind of agreement. Yeah?
I mean, if we don't agree to drive on the same side of the road, there will be accidents.
Yeah.
In fact, even agreeing to drive on the same road doesn't preclude that. But do we have to make this distinction? I mean, what if you were to just start those mid-level ontologies where they start now and not worry about whether you're defining these to be subclasses of continuous
so
or subclasses of occurrence? Can you give an example of the kind of conflict that might occur should we do that?
So I gave you the disease example. I'm just trying to think of an example that might be more convincing generally. So I think probably a more generally convincing example would have to go something like this. The logic which governs data describing continuance is different from the logic which governs data describing occurrence. So continuance can gain and lose parts with time. They can gain and lose molecules. They can gain and lose cells. They can gain and lose qualities. So you can be brown one day and white the next day because you've come out of the sun. So continuants can gain and lose qualities, parts. They can even change their type. So a larva is not going to be a larva for the whole of its existence. It will one day be a butterfly. Now, occurrents never change their type. They never lose parts and wholes. They never change or lose qualities. Occurrents are what they are timelessly, because they never change, because they are changes, and changes can't change. Changes can't change. Changes are changes.
So are you saying the difference is just the time?
So you're saying there's no such thing as a second derivative?
Yeah.
No, if a
There's no time on time. There's no derivative on time.
no, there is, but they're timelessly. So this is a motion which is regular. This is a motion which is accelerating.
Well, I'm just saying, you're saying the time derivative on the current entity is 0. There is no time change.
So if you look at a process, so now I guess we should
Which I presume would then, if you were looking at it IT or information-wise, you'd say a query that involves time for an occurrent is not allowed because there is no time.
No, because this is an occurrent motion which takes place between time 0 and time 1. During that time, it accelerates. You can say all of those things. But it itself doesn't change. I just drew it. That's what it is, timelessly. This is a different occurrent.
But the word timeless, to me, means no time. Without
No,
time,
what
there is
holds
no
of it
time.
holds timelessly. So this is an accelerating process. So you can shave. You will not have a mustache tomorrow. And then you can grow your mustache again.
Right.
That's you. You are identical even though
But
you
as far
change.
as the
Something similar
right.
never happens in the realm of occurrence.
So in this concept of you, which you were using here,
The I will borrow money from you.
Will you be here
Concept.
tomorrow, and are you the same? In that context, then that you is timeless.
So that
There is no change over time for that entity.
but it's clear that I change in all kinds of ways, but yet I remain the same.
Well, something's not changed. I mean, I'm just trying to get to the.
Yeah, now
clarity.
you're trying to get to the philosophical
I'm
core,
trying to
and
get
I'm
to very
saying
precise clarity.
you will never get to the philosophical core.
Because it does all come down to doing inquiries, and if we're not intending to use these structures for some derivative purpose, then why bother putting them together? So we are intending to use.
So
this
you are,
information
yeah,
later.
yeah.
And so I'm just saying, to me, the only difference between do it or don't do it would be it's useful or it's not useful, and then that's where the question would come up. Oh, here, I'll give you this case. It's not useful in this case to try to do that. That's why we separate these things.
Right. So I know that it's useful because people are using it and they come back for more.
But the question
And
would be, I think to come back to answer his would be, give me a case where it would or wouldn't be useful to make these decisions.
Yes. So
And he's saying, why can't we just come in below all this, carry on with what we want to know?
so very many of you have to deal with phenomena like this, where you have one continuant, so for instance, species. Well, let's keep it simple and just have two. So this is species 1, this is species 2, this is species 3. There is a time here. Now, there's a relation between species 2 and species 1, which we're going to want to capture. Yes, so I will call that derivation. Species 2 derives from species 1, and species 3 derives from species 1. Now, what does derivation mean? How are we going to define derivation? Well, we're going to have to say something like this, that there are members of species 2 which are connected in some specific biological way, for instance, through sexual reproduction, with members of species 1, which existed earlier. So the general species level talk says that species 2 is derived from species 1, but to make sense of that general species level talk, we have to have discussion of instances, members of species 2 and members of species 1, and specific events which took place at specific times. For instance, reproductive events. Now, the Buffo framework, and I have some slides later which I probably won't get to, defines all of these things and shows where we need to include the time index, where we don't need to include the time index. Now, the processes come with the time index built in. That's why truths about processes hold timelessly, because they're already time-stamped in and of themselves. You're not time-stamped. I'm not time-stamped, as is proved by the fact that tomorrow we will both be different. And similarly, a species is not time-stamped. There is a time before which there were no members, and presumably there will be a time after which there are no members. But the species itself is changing. The members of the species are changing. There are more of them at some times and fewer of them at other times. So we keep track of processes and we keep track of continuance in two different ways. And that is expressed in the logic, which I hope I will get to. Now, this is worked out to some degree.
What are the occurrences in that picture?
The occurrence are, first of all, the speciation event. And then multiple events of biological reproduction. The lives of all the members. The life of the species, which is a kind of aggregate of the lives of all the members. And I'm sure you could think of more, but they're the ones that come to mind immediately.
But do you then, I guess one of the things that I was looking at, trying to sort this out in my mind, is if you talked about species here, I can think of a species as a thing, as a taxon concept, that has properties as defined by whoever described the species. But we quite typically use species as a property tied to an organism in our databases. So both of those are continuous.
So my preferred view of species is as a population. So we have a population of organisms. So this population has members. The organisms are sexually reproducing. And this population preserves its identity across a certain space of time, rather like the institute which Pierre was mentioning. So it gains and loses members because of sexual reproduction.
You have just pissed off the entire cladistic
biological
community by going back to the biological species concept and dumping on the evolutionary species.
So I was trying to be neutral. Obviously, I failed.
No, I'm not taking sides here, except each one of those three branches is a unique evolutionary lineage. And that's the evolutionary species concept.
So, and I don't see why what I just said is incompatible with that.
This is going to be another one of those philosophical things.
Yeah.
You don't want to go there. This is,
I certainly don't want to go there.
Argument.
You shouldn't have put it on the board. Yeah.
Well, whatever I put on the board, I only wrote the word population. That's all I did.
Just erase it. Just remove it.
I'll erase the word population.
I remember some young lad on Taxicon one day, high school student, posting a simple question. I'm working on a paper, what is a species? I think that went on for like a year.
It's still going.
It's still going.
All right, so I would like to have a good answer, and obviously I do not yet have a good answer, but I'm sure whatever answer is good will at least be compatible with this, even if it's not. Yes?
How critical to the degradation of the ontological framework is that someone starts misplacing occurrence in continuance and vice versa?
So I believe that if you're working in the biological world and building ontologies, you will get lots of benefits if you join this approach. You'll get benefits in that there's already a lot of work, there's already a certain amount of expertise, it's well tested. Now, I don't know of any, so Dolce shares all of this, and Sumo, which is the other big upper-level ontology, shares all of this. So I do not know any developed top-level ontology resource which doesn't share all of this. All of this. So there is no process ontology which has been developed in anything like this way of sophistication, to my knowledge, and I think I would know about it. So you've got a lot of work on your hands if you choose that alternative. I don't know what would be a further alternative.
No, I'm okay. Let's just say that for the sake of the exercise, that we all accept that these concepts and we go along, but we're gonna make mistakes. So eventually, we're gonna put a term or a concept in the wrong placeholder as a continuant or an occurrence.
Yeah.
So how is this going, that mislabel or misclassification going to affect?
So the key is that what you do when you start working on ontologies within this kind of framework is going to be collaborative. So other people will be watching over your shoulders, and you'll be watching over their shoulders. And that kind of mistake is actually not the kind of mistake that you'll make. So Buffo is more than just this. And the mistakes are more likely to be made when we start dealing with more complex entities like protocols or sample IDs or reports. They are the hard ones. These are the easy ones. And so in spite of what he says, these are actually easy to deal with.
I think a very pragmatic answer to your question is if you put things in the wrong category, it doesn't happen to have to happen at the level of Buffo. It can happen much lower in your ontology. Your reasoners don't work. That's why it's important to put things in the right class.
Yeah.
And
providing
that goes
you have
all
definitions.
Well, if you put them in the wrong class, then your definition is not going to match.
Yeah.
If you define something one way and it's not what it actually is, it doesn't actually match the superclasses, then your definitions won't be compatible with the ontology structure. You'll turn on your reasoner and suddenly you'll get results that don't make any sense because something's, it'll end up telling you that the wind blowing is a kind of flower or something weird like that. Yeah.
Nope, good. So the architecture of the Obo foundry is based on this but threefold distinction. So the continuants are independent continuants, which is the anatomy and molecular biology. The dependent continuants are the qualities and functions, and the occurrence are the processes. And this is granularity here. And I already described this, but I'll say it again, because this is really probably the most important thing I will say. So I'll say it with certain ritual emphasis. When you're building ontologies or ontology-like resources, in which I include the Darwin core, you're not doing your job unless you define every term. And that means a proper definition. And it should be in English, and it should be ideally in a logically equivalent form. You'll get benefits from both sides. You'll get benefits for humans from the first, and you'll get benefits for computers in the second. And they should both control each other, so that you'll get a lot better human definitions if you're forced to use the logic, and you'll get better logical definitions only if you first work out the English definitions. So you need definitions. And I did not see definitions in the Darwin core that would stand up to the basic principles of writing definitions yet. But I haven't studied the Darwin core so that I could be confident that I'm right about that. But now, it's very easy to write definitions. What you do is you have already some ontology that you've worked out. So for instance, you have Buffo, and you want to define what a cell is. Well, you go to the next highest term in the ontology, and you say, a cell has to be a special kind of object. Now, what kind of object is it? Well, it's a biological object. It has a certain unity. It's the smallest biological object which has a certain unity. So there you have your definition as soon as you've filled out the gaps. A cell is an object which does such and such. And then a CD11C low plasmacytoid dendritic cell is a cell which has low plasmatocytoid something. And you have your definition. Now, so every definition should be of the form, an A is a B which sees, where B is the next term in the ontology, upwards. Now, that brings multiple benefits. First of all, writing the definition checks for the correctness of your ontology classification. Secondly, the ontology classification tells you how to start the definition, so you get the twofold control. Thirdly, every definition encapsulates, in just one word, all of the content of the ontology above. And this corresponds to the way we use general terms. We use general terms so that we can forget everything which is above them in the hierarchy. But also, there are certain standard problems that people have in formulating definitions. And the most important one is circularity. When people write definitions, they almost always start off by writing circular definitions. So my favorite one is, a mouse is the name of mus musculus. Now, a mouse is not a name. And that is a circular definition, which is also, for other reasons, a bad definition. Now, following this simple rule, the A is a B which C's rule, solves the problem of circularity. All right, anyway, it helps to solve the problem of circularity. So let's very quickly look at the Ogham's ontology. So the idea of Ogham's is that every clinical counter rests upon this process. You have a patient who is not yet a patient. The patient is healthy. The patient has a disorder at some point, some tiny disturbance in some organ. And the patient carries out self-assessment, and the result comes back, no pain, no problem, because it's such a tiny disorder that there's no manifestation. But then the disorder gets bigger or more intense. And the patient carries out self-assessment, and a symptom comes back, pain here. And so the patient goes to the doctor performs a physical exam. The physical exam leads to a clinical finding which prompts a diagnostic process which leads to the request for a lab test, which brings back a lab finding, which then prompts this cyclical process: history taking, physical exam, specimen isolation, lab test, until eventually you get a diagnosis which issues in a plan for treatment. You take the treatment and you get better. So that's the domain of Ogham's, all of that. And you see how important it is to distinguish between continuance and occurrence. The disorder is a continuant. The disorder is like a mountain. It doesn't have any boundaries around the outside, but it's there nonetheless. It has a peak. And if your treatment plan works, then the disorder will shrink. So you will continue to exist, but the disorder will cease to exist. But the disorder, which is a carcinomatous liver or whatever it might be, ceases to exist. You just have a liver. All right, so, and this is the ontology for general medical science in the bioportal, which is the NCBO resource for investigating ontologies, which you should all be familiar with if you're not familiar with it. And so this is a close-up view of what happens with a particular disease. So you have coronary heart disease. Initially, this is just small lesions and small plaques. And then it becomes a heart disease with silent infarction. Then there is surface disruption of plaque. Then there is unstable angina. And then, if you're lucky, there is stable angina. Now, this is one continuant, which is your disease, which instantiates different universals at different times, but it's always the same coronary heart disease. Rather like the larva and the butterfly earlier on, or the fetus and the infant and the adult. All right, so now these are just illustrations. The cirrhosis of the liver is a disease of environmental exposure. And so a disease is a disposition to have a certain disease course, but you may also have a predisposition to get a certain disease. So that would be something like HNPCC, which is a genetic predisposition to get colon cancer. All right, now there are so this is Ogham's. It's a 200 or so terms structured is a hierarchy. Every term has a very precise logical definition and an English definition. All the terms are perfectly recognizable. Everyone would understand them. And it's being used then as a starting point for more specific disease-related ontologies. So sleep or demographics or an ontology of vital signs or mental diseases. And then most importantly for our purposes, the infectious disease ontology. So if there is one example which illustrates the advantages of this approach, then I think it's IDO. And what IDO does is it generalizes the benefits of the Buffo top-level ontology at a lower level. So IDO is divided into the IDO core, which consists of the general terms which apply across all infectious diseases, which are terms like host, pathogen, virulence, vector, host resistance, host herd immunity, and so forth. So they're found everywhere that you have infectious diseases. But then we have IDO extensions which are disease-specific and which are developed by the experts in those specific diseases. And IDO provides a starting point, which is a very rich starting point when it comes to the logical care which has been taken in building it, so that the people building the extensions can do their work rather quickly. So Ramona is involved in a plant infectious disease ontology, and I think I can say that you saved a lot of time because you
had to figure out what a disease was.
Yeah, for instance. And it worked very well, so it sort of proved it.
If you're coming at it from a novel perspective, but it's once you get the hang of
Yeah.
it, it's very helpful.
Yeah, and it meant that a plant biologist who didn't really have much of a background in disease could import a large number of terms which are already settled and apply them to the plant case. And in some cases, it was easy because it just meant deleting. So the problem is that infectious diseases are evolving all the time. And so we want IDO itself to be evolving by means of extension ontologies, in tandem with the way in which the disease is involved. So we have an HIV extension, we have a malaria extension, we have a flu extension, and we've done quite a bit of work with Staph aureus. So we have the IDO Staph aureus ontology, which is the core of all our Staph aureus ontologies. And then we have the IDO rat Staph aureus ontology. We have the IDO methicillin-resistant Staph aureus ontology. And we have the IDO human Staph aureus ontology, which extends the IDO Staph aureus ontology in something like the way that the IDO rat Staph aureus ontology extends the IDO Staph aureus ontology. And the IDO human Staph aureus ontology is also an extension of the IDO human bacterial infectious disease ontology, because Staph aureus is a bacterium. And similarly, the human strep ontology extends human bacterial.
Are these all only when they're in their infectious phases as well? Because obviously
So the IDO has to deal with the fact that infectious diseases have various phases. So you can have the dormant phase, you can have carriers which have the pathogen but are not ill. So it deals with all of those cases. Now, so I'll give you some examples of IDO definitions. So to be the host of an infectious agent, which might be to be the carrier of an infectious agent, or it might be to be infected by an infectious agent, means to have a role which is borne by an organism in virtue of the fact that its extended organism contains an infectious agent, where the extended organism is the organism plus all the orifices. And that's actually defined. So an extended organism is an object aggregate consisting of an organism and all material entities located within the organism, overlapping the organism, or occupying sites formed in part by the organism. Where a site is a term in Buffo meaning a cavity or hole with an H. An infectious agent is a pathogen whose pathogenic disposition is an infectious disposition. So there are several hundred definitions of that sort, which exist also in logical form. And now, as I think everyone will know, Staph aureus is a very mutation-friendly disease. So there are, every month or so, new Staph aureus strains which are discovered, and there is a database of Staph aureus strains. And what we did was, the database is based on free text, so it doesn't have any logical structure. But we managed to convert the Staph aureus database, the strain Staph aureus database, into a logically well-structured resource so that you can now ask logical queries to the database. And we do this by creating what are, in effect, personalized Staph aureus ontologies. So for each Staph aureus strain, we can generate an extension of IDO, which would be the ontology for that strain. And we can do that automatically. And this is a step towards personalized medicine for infectious disease, which I think is, I think it's actually very impressive. So this is, this makes data which is already being collected, but which is inaccessible except by people basically looking up in a dictionary. It makes that data accessible to computation. And so I don't think we need to go through this. So this is the staphylococcal cassette chromosome elements, which are captured in the database. But you can find information about all of these things in the database, but you can't do Boolean searches, which would enable you, say, to find whether all the patients with this strain are also classified in the data. Well, and you can see, roughly speaking, how it goes. And it enables you to study things like this. And we talked about plant IDO. Now, I wanted to say one thing about plant IDO, because I think that this may be relevant to some of the work that some of you are doing with regard to things like nativeness, is that the word? And establishment. And so you have, you're doing an inquiry into organisms within a specific geospatial locus. And you want to ask questions like, is this organism native to this locus, or is this an outlier, and so forth. Now, I don't know whether this is true, but we have done quite a bit of thinking about such issues in building IDO in relation to whether a given bacteria is native to the organism. So some bacteria are native to the organism, and some are native, but there are too many of them, and so you're infected. Some are alien to the organism, but there are too few of them, so you're not infected. Now, it seems to me that those kinds of definitions within IDO may be relevant for defining corresponding terms within the extra-organismal world of organisms. So anyone who is interested, I can help you find possible counterparts within IDO, just as a means of, first of all, seeing whether it might be useful, but also of giving you a source of definitions, because these definitions are conceivably transportable into the extra-organismal space without too much work. All right, so now let's go back to Buffo. Oh, I have all these. Let me just switch off. Well, I can't switch off the sound. So let me just repeat something which I said in passing. So an ontology is a representation of types, and those types have instances. So a type might be organism, it might be species, and then an instance of species might be rat or mouse. Or it might be a process type, such as disease course, or dying, or reproducing, or speciation. So all of those would be ontology in ontology speak, types, and the corresponding processes would be instances of those types. Now, here we have a map of the London Underground. Anyone see what's wrong with it? The circle line is missing. That's why you feel somewhat troubled. So this is a map of the London Underground. And in fact, like every map, it contains two kinds of information. It contains information about instances. For instance, this particular station here is an instance of the type station, but then it contains also information about types. So some stations are interchange stations, and that's a type of station. Some stations are stations with connections to the national rail, and that's another type of station. So an ontology is like a legend for a map, and the map itself provides the data about the instances. And so to put that in very, very explicit terms, an ontology is a representation of types. And we learn about types by looking at the results of experiments in the form of scientific theories. Scientific theories are formulated using general terms. Those general terms are the terms used in the ontology, and the ontology thereby represents the corresponding types or universals or generals in reality, sometimes called classes. And then the experiments themselves, which is when we observe things in reality, relate to the instances, the particulars, which instantiate those types. So it's important to keep two levels in our minds. On the one hand, we have the level of what is general, the ontologies, and then on the other hand, we have the level of what is particular, which is primarily a level captured by databases. So a database is itself a type. It's on the level of generality, but any given database is going to be an instance of that type. And types come in hierarchies very often, where instances do not come in hierarchies. And now, if we have types and we have instances, then we have to think about relations. And now I did this scrawly diagram here with relations between species. I said also there were relations between the instances. Well, now we can see this in a more official form. When it comes to binary relations, we have to distinguish between three different kinds of binary relations. First of all, there are relations between types, such as human is a mammal or human heart is part of human. Then we have relations between an instance and a type. So this human John is an instance of the type human, or this human John is allergic to the type Tamiflu. And there are many other such examples. This is actually the most important one for our present concerns. And then there are relations between instances. Mary's heart is part of Mary, and Mary's aorta is connected to Mary's heart. So these things here are defined in terms of these things here, logically speaking. So the relations in an ontology, which are used to define the ontology terms and which are used to create these hierarchies, are themselves defined in terms of instance-level relations. So here they are represented by means of bold, non-italic versus italic, non-bold. Yeah?
What is the distinction between instance of and RDF type?
So I don't know that there is any relation, so I'm puzzled why you should ask that question.
Well,
you mean, so you're thinking not of RDF type, but of X is a RDF type. Yes? So
you could take an identifier that is representing some object, and you could say that object is a human, or that object
Good. Okay, so I think I'm going to be addressing this in a few slides, but basically there is no difference. Except that, of course, people may build RDF triple stores in which the types are not the kinds of things which scientists would recognize as types or universals or general structures of reality. So let's suppose that we introduce into our triple store information about this meeting, and then we say John Deck is of the type participant. That would not be a type that would go into an ontology, because the set of participants in this meeting is just another instance. It's a collection. So that, but the idea is the same. The RDF is one way of capturing syntactically what I am writing out in full in this way.
So you're saying they're pretty much the same thing?
The one is just a syntactical way. Both of them are actually syntactical ways of capturing the same thing, yes. All right, now, as I just said, the type level relations are defined in terms of the instance level relations. And I'm going through this in some detail because it's relevant for the afternoon session. And then when we deal with is-a, it's very easy to say that A is a B or A is a subtype of B. It is just to say that A and B are types and all the instances of A are instances of B. So the reason why every human is a mammal is because every instance of human is an instance of mammal. It's as simple as that. But with part of and with the other relations, it's a bit more difficult. So what you mean when you say ontology term A is part of ontology term B is that everything which is an A is, at the instance level, an instance level part of something which is a B. So to say that human heart, part of human, is to say that every instance of human part is part of.
So this is mainly a question of cardinality.
Well, there are going to be far more instances typically than there will be types. But this would still work even if there were a very small number of instances, including only one. So that everything which exists is part of the universe. Now, it's important that if you're building an ontology, then if you assert relations which form the edges connecting the nodes in the ontology, then these relations have to hold universally. So this is why we say all some. And the reason for that is because we want transitivity. So if we want to assert that A is part of B and B is part of C, then we want to be able to infer that A is part of C. But we can only do that if part of means every A is part of some B and every B is part of some C. Because only then will it follow that every A is part of some C. And similarly for all the other relations. As we were saying earlier, for continuant classes on the instance level, part of is time indexed. So to say that A part of B for continuants A and B, such as organism, means that given any particular A and any time t, if A is an instance of A at t, then there is some instance of B such that A is an instance level part of B at t. Now you don't need that for occurrence. I don't know whether I have it. No, you don't need that for occurrence. For occurrence, you can just say A is part of B means given any A, there is some B which it's part of. So this is a difference between continuance and occurrence, logically speaking. And now we can see how this works by looking at some specific representations of the relations I was talking about earlier. So we have the derives from relation. So every zygote is derived from some ovum. Every zygote is derived from some sperm. What does that mean? Well, pictorially it means that if we have an instance of the type zygote that's big C1 at T1, then earlier there has to be an instance of the type ovum and an instance of the type sperm. Now that can be generalized to other kinds of biological derivation relations, but the important thing for our purposes is that the C and C prime here are different continuants which merge, just in the way that your worm split earlier, so that we end up with one new continuant from a certain time point. And all of these things are instances, and the capital C's that represent types. And then we have a simpler case, which is transformation of, where one thing becomes another thing at a certain time. One instance stays the same. C is still C here. But at this time, C is an instance of big C. And at this time, C is an instance of big C1. Now, I used to think that I had a good example of this, which is what happens when you die. So you are now an instance of the type human being, but you are now an instance of the type corpse. Now, I'm not any more sure that that's a good example, but anyway, it will give you some idea. The best I can do in the way of a reason is that doctors will treat the corpse as a human being. So they will say, John is over there, or... even my reasons for not thinking this is such a good example are not very good, so... But the point is, it's the same instance, different types. Actually, a better example, let me give you a better example, would be when a larva becomes a butterfly, or when a child becomes an adult. So even you were once a child, but you are now an adult. So you were, at that time, an instance of the universal child, and you're now an instance of the universal adult. And we have a rule which says that every adult was once a child, but we don't have a rule which says that every child will become an adult.
What about a wild polar bear that then becomes a zoological specimen in a museum or something like that, or in a zoo?
So that's the corpse example again.
Yeah.
Maybe it is a good example. He's shaking his head.
Well, at least in that sense, it's not common to change terminology about, you know, like oh, it's a human, now it's a corpse. You know, it's a fox, it's still a fox. We don't call it dead fox.
Right.
So, I mean, along the lines of what you were saying, common language wouldn't.
Yeah.
Wouldn't
So, in other
distinguish.
words,
It's the pride of human existence.
So it would be that what was a fox is now playing the role of a sample.
Yeah, right.
So it's a role thing. All right. So we can define all of these things, and this is our attempt to deal with the issue of granularity, which we were talking about earlier. But now I think we'll break for lunch.